Hey folks, welcome to a brand new series here on Passion for Sound. What I've got for you today is the first episode in a brand new series that I'm calling the Tune Up. And I want to start by saying a huge thanks to channel patron Das Ninja Sticks for coming up with the name. I threw this out to patrons for them to help me come up with a creative title for this. And what the Tune Up's all about is it's me sharing with you some albums that I've found particularly interesting. So there's going to be one album per episode, and the albums I'm going to be sharing could be for all sorts of different reasons. It might be that it's an album that's really caught my attention for its recording quality and therefore might be a great test album. Or as is the case in this video, it might be just an album that I love musically. In all cases, I will talk about how the albums sound on a great system, and I might even share some things to listen out for if you're auditioning them on a fantastic system. But it's mostly about me sharing music that I've found I really enjoyed for one reason or another, and that hopefully you'll enjoy too. I'll deliberately try to make them pretty diverse, so if you don't like the album in this episode, the next episode is probably going to be something completely different. The one final thing I want to mention before I talk about today's album is that these videos have been made possible in part by the sponsorship deal I made with Linsol. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll know that I posted recently about the fact that Linsol reached out to me and offered sponsorship. And as part of that deal, these tune-up episodes are going to be brought to you by Linsol. So thank you very much to Linsol. If you're not familiar with Linsol, they're a Chinese-based online audio retailer. They've got lots of different brands, including a couple of house brands like T Audio and also Harmonic Dyne. And I've reviewed a bunch of their products, will continue to review some of their products, and I've really liked much of what I've heard. Not all of them, but many of them. So if you're not familiar with Linsol and or you want to say thank you to them for making this series of videos possible, then do jump through the link down below, check out what they've got to offer, and maybe pick something up from them next time you want to make a purchase. But for now, let's jump into today's album on the tune-up, and that's Black Pumas by Black Pumas. This is a 2019 release and was produced by one of the members of Black Pumas, that being Adrian Quesada. And how I came across this one is that I run a playlist called a Discovery playlist, and whenever somebody suggests an album or I come across a suggestion in a streaming service or Rune that I think I might like, I just chuck it in this playlist. And then I move my way through it. I decide the ones I want to keep for long-term listening and the ones that I'm happy to have heard once and not really listen to again. And so I was cooking away one night in the kitchen. I just had this playing through my Sonos speakers, and I was immediately captured by the sound and the feel of this album. The genre of this album is described as neo-soul, light psychedelic, and urban grit. To me, though, the best way I can sum it up is that it sounds a little bit like The Heavy, or actually it sounds a lot like The Heavy if you're familiar with them. It sounds like them mixed with a little bit of a dash of Alabama Shakes, and even a little bit of CeeLo Green in a kind of mellow tone. So it's not like upbeat CeeLo Green, so much as more of a ballad version of CeeLo Green. This is a fairly down-tempo album. It's got a little bit of energy to it, so it's not dreary or drab, but it's also not an upbeat kind of dance album. It's more of an album that I think is great for putting on when you're living your life and enjoying a great vibe, a great feel, and some really good tunes along the way. As part of that, one of my channel patrons in our Discord chat was saying that he felt the lyrics in this album were a bit underwhelming, so perhaps it's not an album that I'd recommend for those that like to dive deep into lyrics. I personally haven't really dived too deep into these. I don't mind what I've heard, but I haven't thought too hard about it. But it probably leans to the fact that this is what I would describe as a vibe album. It's an album with a feel, it's an album with a mood, and it's an album that I just thoroughly enjoyed, one track after the next, just seemingly getting better and better as the album went on. Just coming back around for a second to talk about how it sounds, and one thing that I'd mention is that I feel like this is an album that A, gets better as it goes along, but also B, has very much a vibe and a feel of that sort of late 60s, early 70s kind of soul-ish sound. And so what that means for me is that it's an album that if you were to play to me and not tell me when it was from, and indeed I didn't know when it was from when I first listened to it, I thought it was an actual throwback album. I thought it was an album that was from the 70s that somehow I'd missed along the way, and I was wondering where this gem had been sitting all these years. As it turns out, it is a 2019 release, but it's definitely got the soul and the feel of something from maybe the 1970s. Talking about recording quality now, and Black Pumas isn't what I would call a fantastic recording. It's not a bad recording by any stretch, but by adding in that sense of grit, that sort of urban kind of dirtiness, if you like, it has taken a little bit of the edge off the recording and the production. And so what I'd say is it's a well-produced album in terms of they've captured the sound they're looking for, but it's not an album that I think a lot of audiophiles are going to go to as a test album. It's not giving you a perfect insight into your system because there's a bit too much grit and grunge and grime along the way. It is an album that I would comfortably use for things like tonality and timbre. You do have to choose your moments a little bit, as I'll talk about soon. The drum kits don't always sound as good as I'd like them to. But for things like the vocals and some of the guitar work, it's got a nice sense of realism and naturality to it. It's also quite good if you're looking for image separation, so how well your system's able to separate out the different sounds within space. I think it's quite good for that. But I wouldn't be looking at it for things like the soundstage size or things like resolution and micro details, because a lot of that just gets lost in kind of the grittiness that I've already talked about. And so let me step now through 3 of my favourite tracks. Honestly, there's not a track on this album that I don't like, but there are 3 that as I listened to the album and I made a few notes for myself for this episode, there were 3 tracks that kind of stood out for me as having something that caught my attention, and it might be different tracks that you find yourself drawn to. I know again in that Discord chat that I spoke about, some of the patrons were drawn to different parts of this album than I was. But for me, there were 3 standout tracks, and these are in no particular order, they're just the order that I took my notes. But the first one is October 33, or it's actually OCT 33. And what I like about this is it's got a really sort of stripped back sound to start with, and it builds as the track goes on. There's a nice little nod, I think, to Otis Redding in there and his Fa 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 song. There's just a lovely vibe and feel to this track across the board. It's a fairly mellow track, it's got a bit of sadness to it, but it's a track that I really enjoy and it really kind of draws me in each time I listen to it. One thing that's quite interesting about the mix of this track though, is that it's actually a little bit unbalanced. And what I mean by that is a lot of the action happens in the centre with the vocals and then off to the left channel. When the track opens up, there's a lovely kind of clean and lean sounding acoustic guitar. It's still got the grit and the grunge, so it's not pristine clean, but it's a very lean and articulate sounding guitar on the right hand side. But then as the rest of the instrumentation comes in, it's very much in the centre and to the left channels of the mix. And so it's an unusual mix if you pay attention to it, where it does feel a bit lopsided to the left, but not in an uncomfortable way. It doesn't get in the way of listening to it, it's just something I noticed when I started thinking critically. I particularly like the tonality and the qualities of the vocal in this one. And by the way, for those who care, the vocalist and guitarist for Black Pumas is Eric Burton. Basically the band is Eric Burton and Adrian Casada, but then there are of course various studio musicians working on this as well. But one of the things I really like about this track is the quality of Eric Burton's vocals within this track, both the recording but also his delivery. There's a great sense of tonality and texture in his voice and a really good sense of emotions too. So both from a technical kind of audiophile point of view, it's an interesting listen to the vocals, but also from an emotional engagement and general musical enjoyment point of view, it's a wonderfully delivered vocal in my opinion. I mentioned before that sometimes the drums in this particular album don't always capture my attention as being the best possible recording of drums from a testing and naturality point of view. And indeed that does come out a bit in this track. I feel like the drums in this recording are just a little bit lacking in weight. They don't have the body and the presence that I'd like. I think they've been stripped back a little bit to add to that sense of that sort of 70s recording, slightly gritty sort of sound. And it is a bit of a shame. I would have loved to hear this with a better balance of the tonalities of everything. But at the same time, that probably would have robbed some of the vibe from the album, so I totally get why they do it. I'm not suggesting I'm an expert mixing engineer or mastering engineer, and so I'm not for a second trying to be critical here. It's just that I enjoy the music so much, and I enjoy listening to great recordings so much, that I would have loved it if the two had come together in this occasion. But moving on from October 33, the next track that I made some notes on was Touching the Sky. This is one of the last tracks on the album, I think it's the second last. And I'm not sure if I just said Touching the Sky, but it's Touch the Sky is the correct name. And this is definitely not a track that I'd use for testing. From a recording and mixing and mastering point of view, it's not one that sounds great through a fantastic system. It's, again, got that sort of overly gritty sort of sound. But what I love about it is, first of all, it reminds me of the heavy, and I'm a huge fan of the heavy. The other thing that I really like about this track is the inclusion of a horn section. And it's a horn section that's very much got the feel of a lot of the sorts of tracks that would have been sampled into, say, an Amy Winehouse album. So if you've listened to a bit of Amy Winehouse and you know how well she used to bring in the older tracks, so the 60s and the 70s soul tracks as a sample behind her music, this sounds exactly like the sorts of tracks that would be sampled for an Amy Winehouse album. So again, it's got that sort of 60s, 70s soul feel in the brass section, and I love the feel that that brings to this track. There's also some great guitar work, again by Eric Burton, and a really nice kind of crunchy, gritty guitar solo. It's still quite down-tempo once again, but it's got that wonderful kind of gritty feel to it. And so this is very much a track for me that is just purely about musical enjoyment. It's not a great recording, but it also doesn't punish you at all either. It's not one of those deliberately bad recordings that actually robs life out of the music. There's an album by the Constellations that I was incredibly disappointed when I listened to. I'm a huge fan of the Constellations, but I think their second album it was, if I remember rightly, the album's called Doing It For Free. That album was actually deliberately recorded in such a lo-fi way that it just robbed the life from the music for me. Whereas with something like Black Pumas, it's been recorded in a way that does add some grit and some grime, but it hasn't robbed the life of the music. It's still very enjoyable. It doesn't punish you even on fantastic and resolving systems, and that's a great balance point. And so the final track I want to mention brings us back into the middle of the album, and that's Stay Gold. This is probably the track I would most likely use for testing if I wanted a test track from this album, and it's still got the grit that gives you that sort of quality across the whole album so everything sounds the same. But the way the vocals been recorded, the general mixing of this one, even the drums probably sound a little bit fuller, everything's just a little bit better, a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to use from a testing point of view. Again, it's not going to be great for soundstage or micro details and resolution because of that grit and grime, but the tonality and the timbre of things like the vocals, the separation of instruments is all fantastic in this recording. And there's a nice range of instruments as well, so there's a good spread of different instruments around the soundstage to really help you understand how your system's separating things out. But then if you're not interested in it from a technicalities point of view, it's also just a great listen, as is this whole album. One of the standouts from Stay Gold though, and the reason I would choose it as my test track, is there's some organs being played, some electric organs, and then nicely layered there's some activity on the left from the organ, and then probably a second track that's been recorded for the right side, and those are kind of layered on top of each other in a really interesting way. So there's a lot to kind of listen to and unpack in Stay Gold, and that's one of the reasons I like it, and also one of the reasons that I'd use it as a test track, because there's some technical requirements for a headphone and a system to be able to separate things out and give you a clear picture of everything that's going on. There's also both an acoustic and an electric guitar, and so that gives you more layers again of texture and timbre for your system to really resolve correctly. And again, if you're not listening to it from a technical point of view, it also gives lots of musical interest for you to explore as you're just listening to it from a pure musical enjoyment point of view. And so hopefully that's given you 3 tracks to get you started, but ideally check out the links below and go and listen to the whole album for yourself. I think it's a wonderful album. If you like that kind of late 60s, early 70s soul type feel, then I think you'll really enjoy Black Pumas. Maybe you've already heard it before. It's not exactly a deep cut or an obscure album, but it was one that I hadn't heard of and I wanted to share with you. And so to wrap things up here, I want to say thanks again to Linsol for sponsoring this episode. I also want to say thank you to you for watching it, and also encourage you, if you've got any feedback or thoughts, if there's other things you would have liked me to share about this album or talk about or focus on, then drop them in the comments down below. I'm not going to invite suggestions of albums for me to cover in the tune-up in the future because I've already got so many in my discovery queue, and I'm always getting new suggestions from patrons in the Discord chat or on reviews or just through my different streaming services. So please don't be offended if you do put album recommendations down below. There's a good chance I'm just going to like it, heart it and move on and not reply. And that's purely because I've already got plenty of options available. But again, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'd love to know how you found it, what you'd like to see in future. And if you have enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like this, then please do hit the like button, consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.